Hi, we're going to continue with the second call and response. Thank you again for joining us for a dense and long day where we try to unpack some of the issues that have arisen in 20 years of public programs on art and politics in the history of the Vera Center. I'm grateful for your being here, you, our audience, and of course very grateful to the panel, to the panelists. The second panel is dedicated to the issue of identity politics, the way it arose in the 1990s, early 1990s, when the Vera Center was founded in 1992, and looked very specifically and over a number of tightly curated programs on censorship, freedom of speech, and gay rights as well. In the previous panel, we had an interesting discussion about identity organizing through self-organized groups or institutions. And Jens Hoffmann, who is our moderator for the second panel now, will pose a similar question on identity through an institutional lens. Without further ado, I'm going to briefly read the brief summaries of very, very long biographies of our esteemed panelists, and then open it up to them. Firelei Bayis is an artist who is in a cab. She is, I think, crossing into Manhattan as we speak, so she'll join us in just a few moments and on this chair. To her left is Anthony Appiah. He's an American philosopher who works as a cultural theorist and novelist as well. His interests include political and moral theory, the philosophy of language and mind, and African and African-American intellectual history. He's currently the Laurance S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy at Princeton. Appiah grew up in Ghana and earned a PhD at Cambridge University. In 1992, Appiah published the book In My Father's House, which won the Herskovits Prize for African Studies. Among his many books after that are Color Conscious, which was edited or written with Amy Gutman, and The Ethics of Identity, that came out in 2005, and then Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers in 2006, which partially inspired this panel. Appiah was awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama in 2012. To his left is Helen Molesworth. She is the Barbara Lee Chief Curator at the ICA in Boston, where she has organized and curated one-person exhibitions of artists such as Catherine Opie, Josiah McElhenney, and group exhibitions such as Dance, Draw, or This Will Have Been Art, Love, and Politics in the 1980s. Formerly the head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art at Harvard University Art Museum, she presented an exhibition of photographs by Moria Devi there, and an exhibition called Act Up, New York, Activism, Art, and the AIDS Crisis, 1987 to 1993. Previously, she was the chief curator of exhibitions at the Wexner, where she organized the first US retrospective of Louise Lawler and Luke Tuymann's work, as well as an exhibition called Part Object, Part Sculpture. From 2000 to 2002, she was the curator of contemporary art at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she organized Work Ethics, which traced the problem of artistic labor in post-1960s art. Then we have Kobina Mercer, who is an art historian of the Black diaspora, examining African-American, Caribbean, and Black British artists in modern and contemporary art. He is professor in the history of art and African-American studies at Yale, where he teaches courses that address cross-cultural aesthetics in transnational contexts, where issues of race, sexuality, and identity converge. Mercer previously taught at NYU and the University of California at Santa Cruz. His first book, Welcome to the Jungle, in 1994, introduced new lines of inquiry in art, photography, and film. Mercer is the author of monographic studies on Rotimi Fani Coyote, Isaac Julian, Renee Green, and Keith Piper, as well as a historical study on James van der Zee, Romar Bearden, and many others, Adrian Piper. He is the editor of Annotating Art Histories series, which is published by MIT and Ineva, and he is a 1999 Vera Center Fellow. Then our moderator, again, Jens Hoffmann, who is a writer and curator based in New York as of 2 or 3 months ago, I believe, when he was appointed the deputy director of the Jewish Museum, where he oversees now exhibitions, collections, and public programs. Hoffmann was the director of exhibitions at the ICA in London from 2002 to 2006, and the director of the CCA Wadis Institute of Contemporary Art in San Francisco from 2007 to 2012. He currently works as curator at large also at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. He has curated and co-curated over 40 exhibitions since 1997, including most recently the 9th Shanghai Biennial and the 12th Istanbul Biennial. In 2009, he founded the Exhibitionists, a journal for exhibition making, and he has been editor-at-large for Moose magazine since 2011. And I think with that, you know that you're in excellent hands. Thank you for coming, and thank you all very much for joining the discussion.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to the Vera List Center for having us. I would like to start our conversation with mentioning an exhibition that is currently on view here in New York, which is New York City 1993, and which together with a show that Helen actually curated, that Karen mentioned already, this will have been at the ICA, which just recently closed, sort of made the case for the relevance of certain political and theoretical ideas that emerged in the 1980s and 90s, and how they manifested themselves in the artworks that were made at that point. Without a doubt, that period was a big cultural and political turning point, both nationally and internationally. And the exhibition that I personally mostly associate with this particular period is, of course, the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which is, of course, also often cynically referred to as the PC Biennial, which pointed to political and social issues in a much more direct manner than any of the previous biennials had done till that point. The biennial's focus on society's investment in art, in my opinion, broke new ground not only within the sphere of curatorial practice, but also in the sphere of institutional politics. And a lot of conversations that emerged that in many ways are still relevant to our conversation today, but of course at the same time, 20 years later, things have changed. We just have to think about all the sort of social, political, economical changes that have happened around the world. We're looking at a different landscape around the world now. And in a way, we can also see that in the last 20 years, we have seen sort of often very violent and aggressive reassertions of certain identities based on ethnicity, religions, or politics. And I suppose that the whole discourse around the notion of identity politics has also become much more complex and nuanced and perhaps developed into other discourses that connect to conversations around globalization, the post-colonial, hybridity, cosmopolitanism, for example. And starting about 6 months ago at the Jewish Museum, these kind of questions around identity, of course, have ever been more important to me, working in a sort of culturally specific institution now. And I'm glad to have this conversation with you guys to also further inform myself and my ideas around what we are planning to do at the museum. So I hope for a very lively discussion. Yesterday when we had a short reception at I think the chair of the board of the Vera List Center, I just mentioned the title of the panel, Identity Politics Revisited, and immediately we had an intense conversation among several people there that immediately started arguing. So let's see what we are going to do. And in preparation for the panel, just like NATO did, I sent the panelists a question that sort of summarizes a little bit about what I've just said. And I'm going to read this question here. And I guess it somehow mirrors a little bit also where I am right now with my work at the museum. What is in need today for museums, academic departments, artists, curators, and so on to dedicate themselves to the knowledge and study of specific ethnic or cultural groups and identities, and how are those engagements different from those or a continuation of the ones that were set out 25 years ago?
We're going to go in backwards alphabetical order, according to, you get to be in the middle no matter what. According to Marcel Duchamp, Anthony was tired of going first. So, okay, well, I had a professor in grad school who said that whose idea of an academic panel was that invariably the first question was phrased, while you were talking, I was thinking. Hence, putting listening in a very problematic category. And I'm afraid that might be a little bit the effect of my remarks, because while I read Jens's question as it was proposed to us via email, it sort of sparked in me a series of reminiscences and questions that I'm going to put forward. I was a young student during the heyday of identity politics, and my recollection of it and my experience of it then was it was a field of extraordinary abundance. It felt like, it didn't feel like a constriction of ideas as it was received by many, I think, but rather for me felt like an extraordinarily expansive opening where I could find myself and my peers and my friends and imagine us as part of a narrative that hitherto I was struggling with finding what our place in this sort of these big historical stories that we tell ourselves. In retrospect, I've come to see identity politics, as I think many did then, as a sort of horrible phrase, because it seems to me what it really was about was a kind of combination of this big category called history with this other category called subjectivity, and that the two wouldn't be allowed to stand opposed to one another anymore, similar to a kind of feminist impulse around complicating any sort of binary relationship between public and private. Identity politics seemed to really be, at that moment for me, and still a kind of very expansive way of thinking about how histories and subjectivities are literally inextricable one from the other. And to combine the two, of course, meant then for me, and still means for me now, ways of telling stories that refuse to maintain the status quo narratives of the victorious and the powerful. And so, as I sort of came through identity politics, I think my sense of being a feminist became very strongly honed, and what I imagined the work of a good feminist to do, because of course that's what always goes unexamined. None of us ever want to be bad at anything. But I was convinced that being a good feminism meant two things. One would read dominant narratives against the grain. So one would read someone like Duchamp, for instance, through the sort of hermeneutic of feminism. And one would also, that would be one form in which identity politics could sort of enact itself in my own work. And that the other way that identity politics worked as a feminist was that I really thought it was my job to go out and recover artists who had not been properly narrated or historicized and insert them into the canon such that they would become part of the story we could tell ourselves. And while I still find both of those forms of intellectual labor important, and I feel that I still participate in both forms, I've actually, as I've gotten older, grown increasingly ambivalent or dissatisfied with both of those modes of my own intellectual activity. And my disease with reading against the grain on the one hand, or sort of this recovery, discovery and recovery mode on the other, really emerged for two reasons. The first reason was, as I tried to put primarily women artists back into the canon, or into the canon, I found myself as a museum curator, so someone who not only writes but is forced with navigating the spatio-temporal logic of the museum and the physicality of objects in the museum, quite dissatisfied with where those recovered objects would go. So do they simply go into a chronological situation when perhaps you're recovering work that wasn't really shown, wasn't really received? So what does it mean to sort of drop it into a gallery of 60s art when in fact its emergence may have been in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s? Like how could we, as museum people, complicate that kind of wonderful, chronological march, to which I'm quite wedded. I love it because it makes me feel very masterful when I walk through museums. And I enjoy that. I enjoy those feelings of mastery. And so that was one reason I became really upset with, or discontent with my own sense of like that I was doing the good work of recovery, because I no longer knew what exactly I could do with those recovered oeuvres or objects or careers or ideas. The other reason I became dissatisfied with sort of reading against the grain or recovery came about while I was organizing a small exhibition on the work of ACT UP, and also came about as that my work on ACT UP morphed into an exhibition about the art of the 1980s. And this will lead me to my somewhat, not a conclusion, but a set of questions. In spending a fair amount of time over the last few years thinking about and writing about and working on the 80s, I, needless to say, have been acutely aware of the extraordinary degree of loss that happened in the 1980s due to the AIDS-HIV crisis. And trying to tell both the ACT UP show and the 80s show with an ear to a kind of respectful quality to the living, because when you tell the history of the relatively recent past, all sorts of notions of mastery around that narrative really have to, they really unravel pretty quickly because there are all these other people who have different ideas, but also wanting very much to carry along with me the dead and feeling responsible for the voices and ideas and objects of the dead. And so this made this kind of work, there was a kind of very delicate, precarious balance that I still don't feel totally at home with, I suppose, in some ways. I never will. But in the course of doing this work, I watched a documentary made by Martin Scorsese on the figure of Fran Lebowitz. And Fran Lebowitz says something in this documentary that haunts me. And she's talking about the AIDS crisis, and I had been, as a curator, primarily concerned with the loss of artists and critics, and very aware that stories and ideas were truncated, and that we didn't know, for instance, like what Felix Gonzalez Torres would make now, what Craig Owens would make now. And I imagined, in fact, much of this work as a kind of fantasied conversation between Craig Owens and Judith Butler in my head, right? Like what would have happened? But Fran Lebowitz talked about something, a different loss, and she said that one of the things that happened in New York in the 1980s was that one of the most sophisticated and erudite and cosmopolitan audiences for culture also died. And so that what was lost was an audience that was incredibly knowledgeable about the culture that they were participating in, witnessing, watching. and that we lost a ballet audience, we lost an opera audience, we lost a museum audience. And I had never thought about the loss of that audience and what that might mean, not only for myself as a producer of culture, as a producer of museum exhibitions designed for a general public that we bemoan continually is increasingly devoid of certain forms of knowledge that make the exhibition legible to them or make our exhibitions. What comes back to us from audiences about exhibitions is very strange now, right? Because we imagine always this very erudite audience, and perhaps the audience is not so erudite. And so how to think about this loss of audience in terms of the reception of knowledge and the passing down of knowledge about culture, and particularly a growing sense I have of queers is, I mean, one of the things queers do is I think we tend the fires of culture. Like we're good cultural custodians. And the loss of this extraordinary break or gap that happens because of the plague years and the crisis years means that there's a gap in that transmission. And of course that means that there's also a kind of radical break that happens as well in the identity of queerness, or even perhaps the identity of something much more old-fashioned that I, of course, resisted vehemently in the 80s, the identity of the homosexual. Because I, of course, identified as queer and still do, and even the word homosexual, I realize, provokes a certain extraordinary degree of anxiety in me still. I can only hear it in the cadence of my grandfather, who also said automobile, so you can get a little bit of what that had an extra syllable, the homosexual, when it came out of his mouth. But that personal tidbit notwithstanding, but I am curious in now what identity politics, what this nexus of history and subjectivity might mean if, and here I will end with some questions, if instead of this realm of abundance, of this intersectionality of identity in which all of these things come to the fore and we are open to difference and all of the laudatory ways in which we speak about difference and speak about heterogeneity, which I cleave closely to both personally, politically, and professionally. But what happens if instead of that abundance, absence becomes, in fact, a much stronger axis along which we could think? And I put it out there because I think we live in a moment, as we know, of extraordinary wealth production for an increasingly smaller number of people. And that wealth production has produced enormous fantasies of abundance across the culture. And I'm feeling very resistant to abundance as a model, and I'm increasingly interested in what kinds of stories and what kinds of theories of absence and scarcity might actually help us tell slightly more, well, I don't know what the more is, more productive, more enabling, more better, smarter, more nuanced versions of this nexus of history and subjectivity as a way of both attending to the absences that are real, but also as a potential way of maybe resisting these narratives of abundance that are increasingly phantasmatic.
Okay, well, good afternoon. I think I responded to the question fairly literal-mindedly, so I'll perhaps just reiterate it. What is the need for museums, academic departments, etc., to dedicate themselves to the study of specific ethnic or cultural identities, and how are those needs different from, or a continuation of, the ones of 20 years ago? I suppose my literal-mindedness is being about against interpretation at one level. But I did notice that need was repeated twice. So it got me thinking that needing and wanting are quite distinct human activities. I went into a hairdresser's in South Central Los Angeles about 20 years ago and was told what you need and what you want are two different things. Which was harsh. There's a slightly more sophisticated way of saying it, which is that the human is constituted by a threefold differentiation between need, demand, and desire. So thinking along those lines, I think in relation to universities, museums, and galleries, there's a sense in which decision makers have the confidence to produce speech acts. I know what I want. I know what quality is. I know what value is. I know what art is. So inevitably, the corollary is, I know what I want, and it's not that. So those decisions are always haunted by the unwanted, which mostly goes without saying. It's axiomatic. It's taken for granted. And I think I'm following on in terms of the issue about the public sphere and the audience that you've raised, in terms of thinking about the common sense, what's taken for granted, where we start from, and what doesn't have to be verbalized, what doesn't have to be said. Because I think that's what's interesting in looking back at what's changed and what hasn't over the last 20 years. So in each of these institutions, galleries, museums, universities, we're involved in the public use of reason. And that demands that one's desires must be tempered by considering what others want or what others say. And I hope I'm not taking the place of the philosopher on the panel here, but I think it's important to emphasize these sort of first principles, if you like, because all the institutions of the humanities and liberal arts really acknowledge the human condition of multiplicity. We all learn from a contest among different viewpoints, and being open to differences is really, in that sense, central to the public use of reason. Is there a sense in which the use of reason has been privatized over the last 20 years? But my main point here to start with is to say that herein lies the tension. Decision makers can say quite confidently, I know what I want, but the institutional superego tells decision makers what you should have, and that's what policy is. It comes from the same etymological root as policing, but also being polite, and the polity is what we have to do amongst others. And what interests me is the way in which the shadow of the unwanted falls onto this scene of public deliberation. I think it's fair to say in broad brushstrokes that since the 1990s, cultural identity and difference have been a scene of conflict and contradiction, yes, but also of compromise and of working through, even if we can't say it, there's a settlement that's actually been achieved. Another way of telling that story, reducing it, would be to use dialectics and to say that 1980s identity politics was the thesis against which the clash of civilizations, the anti-hybridity backlash of the 90s, played antithesis, and in relation to which inclusion has been the synthesis, if you like, a worldwide administrative norm that's been accomplished by the triumph of neoliberal globalization. So for me, the key issue is not so much that the politics of identity is being reflected in art over the last 20 years or in the art world itself, but that art has become an arena in which the very idea of the public sphere is being pushed and pulled in competing directions. And thinking about that question, I think not only 20 years ago, but what we learned with the so-called linguistic turn 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that language does matter. Because I don't think along the lines of two separate compartments, one labeled specific ethnic cultural identities and presumably the other being general ethnic or cultural identities. Because for me, the problem, the project, was to work out how they're interdependent, how they're connected. And we're familiar with the language that was used in the 1980s and how problematic that was, the kind of dichotomous reasoning of center and margin, of subordinate and dominant. It's an either-or logic. But it was strategic in the sense that it got the issue of power relations onto the table. So I use the word interdependent, which perhaps has its origin in dialectical materialism, very old-fashioned. An alternative, bang up to date, might be to think of the rhizome or the network. And the question then is, are we there yet in terms of a model, a vocabulary, for talking about interdependence, how specific and general interrelate? And I'm not quite convinced we are. I think it's an unfinished project. So for me, that repetition of needs in the question was almost like a symptom. I think needs are intransitive. The process, you know, the need for, the human need for attention, the need for food, the need for love, doesn't come to an end. So I think in all these institutions, whether we're talking about a classroom, a museum, or a gallery, that need to study specific differences did not arise 20 years ago. It was there at their very beginning, at the end of the 18th century. I think we've come very belatedly over the long durée of 200 years to an understanding of what was repressed, what got buried at the foundations of these institutions. So I think the language that we have available can be used in that respect to think forward and to think ahead. And I'm sort of starting this way because I think also affect and the affective dimension comes into play, because the unwanted it's not just value neutral, it's a target of resistance amongst institutions. And so the discussion at times gets to be bathed in ressentiment. There's resentment, there are unwanted feelings too. So I've got a couple of examples here. The Arts Council of England has produced policies on cultural diversity since 1976. There are about 8 or 9 of them. Most recent in 2009 was called the Creative Case for Cultural Diversity. So this is the language of justification for public funding. But to my eyes, the fact that these endless reports have a kind of repetitive existence really is a symptom of resistance to something that's wanted. Institutions must comply with these policies in order to get funded, but diversity is often disliked because it's perceived as something that's imposed, it's bureaucratic, it is unwanted. I think the key issue there is not the particular content of these policies, but the very idea of having a policy on the visual arts assumes the public good that's amenable to state intervention, something that can be reformed. We're dealing with the educative state. But then, of course, what's changed since the 1990s are the role of private money, private collectors. And we have a very different situation here. If we think about Charles Saatchi in the UK, we think about the Rubel family in Miami. The speech act seems to be, yes, I want the culturally diverse ones too. So I think there's an interesting disparity that arises when we turn to the reconfiguration of public and private, which is really at the heart of the neoliberal project. And I think the opportunity to contribute to the catalogue for Helen's show about the 1990s gave me an opportunity to really think about how significant art of that period was in terms of going back to the 18th century beginnings of the idea of the public sphere. Whether we call it the democratic public sphere or the bourgeois public sphere is another example of how language matters. So I think in that broader perspective, the culture wars of the 90s was never just about that either-or of censorship versus freedom, which was, I think, the mistake that liberal leftists made. I think it was just too obvious. I think what was going on was definitely a defensive acknowledgement of the veracity of constructionism and performativity. Otherwise, it wouldn't have touched a nerve. And it's important to notice these were mostly representations of the body that seemed to elicit the ire of the neoconservatives. But I think as a result of the culture wars, art was made central to a contest over what defines the public good. And within that, my observation, or one of them, is that the defunding of public sector policies has transferred the kind of shock value or the shock aesthetic of the 20th century avant-garde to the private sector. So that's exactly what the YBA, the Young British Artists of the 1990s, was all about, really. So you have a kind of changing of the guard in which the values of shock, transgression, confrontation associated with the avant-garde are endorsed by private money, whereas multiculturalism is part of officialdom. It's something that we have to do. We have to do our duty for diversity. And I think this is part and parcel of the way in which the art world has become integrated with the culture industry, and the phenomena that Michael Berenson, who was also a Vera fellow, called corporate populism, the blockbuster model of exhibition making, and so on. My second example is to say that the unwanted is subject to all different sorts of defenses. I mean, it seems to be common sense that if you have a need, you find a need and fill it. But of course, needs can be interpreted in many perverse ways. We think of the need for food as being natural and normative, but that's not what an anorexic or a bulimic feels. Such a subject would hate their needs, resent their needs. And it's also interesting, I think, to think about the way that demand gets reinterpreted in acts of misrecognition, so that there's a not hearing of what others are saying. And again, my example is going a bit further back here, in the sense that in 1970, the Art Workers Coalition in New York made numerous demands on the Museum of Modern Art. And in February 1970, William Rubin wrote a memo to the Curator of Architecture and Design, quote, "It would be interesting to have, as the Art Workers Coalition originally suggested, an exhibition on the relationship of African and other ethnic indigenous arts to the tradition of modern painting and sculpture. This would make for a fascinating exhibition, even though that contribution is, I believe, less marked than some people believe. And it would also provide the basis for a useful exhibition." So what you get 14 years later is primitivism, which is the last gasp of a certain kind of high modernist formalism. And the point I'm making here is that African-American artists, like Faith Ringgold, who were part of the Art Workers Coalition, were never outsiders. They were always immanent to the public sphere, where they critiqued the museum in the name of the common good. African-American artists have always been involved in the public use of reason, demanding institutions to live up to their universalist ideal, and questioning those arbitrary points of closure that prevent them from fulfilling them. So I would backdate the framework of the conversation, not just to the last 20 years, but perhaps the last 200 years. I think identity politics, a very problematic phase of the 1980s, was a reinscription of the new social actors of the 1960s, but it was also an extension of the project to radicalize democracy. So we could think about voices of the 18th century as well. We think in the African-American context of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Paul Robeson. These are black diaspora speech acts that all involve universalist claims to radicalize democracy beyond sectional interests. So whether that's counter-hegemonic, counter-modern, or counter-public, so these are all examples about why language matters. The aim was to reconfigure those interdependent relationships. But of course, the public use of reason is never purely rational, is it? It's always mediated by these acts of reinterpretation and by the cross-cutting affects that are involved in our identifications too. And I think here, the neoliberalism really draws our attention to the way in which possessive individualism has become the ruling common sense. It seems to pervade political discourse in civic society across the board, really naturalizing the assumption that the pursuit of self-interest is the only motor of social action. And I think what happens there is that the practice of critique, when it's voiced by African American and other black diaspora subjects, gets misheard as a minoritarian complaint. And I think the shift I see over the last 20 years could be described as a decline of the practice of critique and the rise of complaint. I mean, that's what Robert Hughes meant when he called The Culture of Complaint, his book of the mid-1990s. So my third example, and I've thought long and hard about this in terms of, well, really giving myself permission to say it, is the journal October, which since 1976 has been really important in terms of raising the bar intellectually. It's something that I turn to continuously. I'm glad that it's there, and long may it continue. But I think it's also fair to say that this is not where we go to find out about difference and diversity in the worlds of modern and contemporary art. Now, I suppose part of my wanting to raise this respectfully and as part of a constructive, responsible contribution to a debate is that concern about, well, if I said that, this might risk being misheard as a kind of resentment. They've got it, you wanted it, you didn't get it, so therefore that's why you're criticizing them. I think this is the kind of common sense calculation that's become embedded in a lot of, in the kind of, the rise of that corporate populism that results in what Helen was describing, the loss of a knowledgeable audience that has the capacity to understand that you're only in a subject position or the place from which you perform a speech act as a result of an identification. So I do wonder whether we're sometimes too polite. I talked a little bit about the etymology of that, and I think that the whole idea of political correctness was a kind of crisis management in terms of the collapse of those norms of civility that existed in the bourgeois public sphere, taking full account of discrepancy between its idealized self-image and those who had to be excluded for it to become operational. And the contemporary state of play. And I do think there's a sense in which political correctness was a kind of stopgap measure, an attempt, a kind of manic reparation, if you like, to fill the gap. I probably exceeded by 6 or 7 minutes. But my last example is just to say that I think this idea of post-black is completely premature. We're only just starting to get a grip of the cross-cultural entanglement of different modernisms. And in relation to that dialectical scheme I offered, it's important to recognize that it's only in the last 15 years that art history as a discipline, as an institution, has come to accept that there might be more than one. So we're only at the beginning of this project, and ideas like Afro-modern might be a starting point rather than a conclusion. But nonetheless, I think post-black is a symptom of wishful thinking in many regards. And what it got me to thinking of, and this will be my last point, I wish I could end on a question constructively, but I probably won't. It's to think about Kara Walker's experience being pinioned between prize-giving and punishment. And one of the best articles I've read on Kara Walker is by Amna Malik, who's at the Slade. And this was in a book called Shame and Sexuality that was co-edited by a former colleague of mine, Claire Pajawaska, from a conference at the Freud Museum. But there's a sense in which I think throughout the last 200 years, you don't criticize, one black person does not criticize another black person in public. It's one of those unspoken rules. It's not a norm because it's not official. It's a coping strategy. It's overdetermined. I think there's a sense in which this scene of antagonism between African-American artists of the 60s generation and the post-black outlook of a contemporary artist such as Kara Walker had to do with the way in which she transgressed this unwritten rule and the way in which the process of making viable living with difference, living with diversity, is manifested amongst minority subjects, African-American subjects too. And I think that often gets precluded when we think in either or terms about insiders, outsiders, or we use very simplistic modes of calculation such as inclusion and exclusion.
So I feel like my response was even more literal than yours. And it's probably coming from a personal practice and a place where all these things that happened are probably less from memory than from an invented collage of sorts of knowledge. So I would say that the need for these institutions to still exist, it's almost to reinforce these fantasies of what an identity is. And a lot of times when you think of identity, for me, it's been a place where you think it's a privilege to acknowledge an identity. But in truth, it should be a right. You should be able to acknowledge all the different aspects of yourself. So even as a Dominican Haitian, there are so many different diasporas and histories that are erased in order to create this sense of solid, singular self. So you usually present yourself as this Afro-European that's pretending to be native. You try to erase both those painful histories by skipping over that. And Dominicans are the first to describe themselves as any food object possible, so your caramel chocolate, something else. And there's never really black or Asian or anything else that might be part of it, because you have this fantasy that's essential for you to keep moving on. And it's interesting to hear you speak of post-identity and have it be post-black. And it's essentialized, I feel like, in the US. You have either or, even though it's been acknowledged that we have this incredible multifaceted history, and that each part of those deserves a place of privilege, and has a right to be put in the forefront. It's reduced to post-black, which just erased too many things to begin with, and postmodern and Afrofuturist. You go into places of like science fiction and surrealism and all these different things to reinforce those fantasies. So I would say they're essential because there's a risk of just homogenizing everything. October selects a few and highlights. All the major institutions will select a few token representatives and, coast through with that. So I'd say open up the field. It's a simple one. Open up the field, explore all the multifaceted spaces, but keep that that space of privilege where you can showcase all the differences within individual groups. That might have gotten a little bit too messy in the explanation there, but Asia societies are able to explore how they had transitions and connections between Africa and Latin America and all these different places, but that doesn't mean that they have to now transition to a Caribbean center or an African center. So in the place we are now, we're able to explore that all the different facets of ourselves, but keep the institutions intact. Does that make any sense? Okay.
Well, thank you all very much. I mean, I suppose what I wanted to say was just about the last period is that, first of all, like Kobena, I tend to think of it, it's just how I think, as part of a much longer set of processes going back at least to the Enlightenment, which is, after all, the moment at which the modern institutions of the museum and the university, the ones that you mentioned, were given their shape. But just thinking about the last 20 years, the first thing I wanted to say was it seems to me that sort of identity is inescapable in these institutions. There's no way of, as it were, escaping identity. So the idea that we've been through a period in which identity and its politics were important for the university and the museum, and that now we might get beyond that, just strikes me as, I think that just, I don't understand what that proposal would look like. I don't understand what it means. So I put up a couple of images here. I was at the biennial in Sao Paulo last summer, and I was at the biennial in Sao Paulo last summer, and inevitably I walked across the park to the Afro-Brazilian Museum. Why? Because I grew up in Africa. And I responded to that museum in a way that had resonance through my identity, as well as two things that had, as it were, nothing to do with me in any sense except as being human. And I think that's just how, if you think as a curator, you have to know that people will respond through their identities, whatever you do, however hard you try, even if you try and talk to them, talk to your visitors, your audience, in a way that is meant to as it were, be anti-identitarian, they will respond through their genders and their nationalities and their religions and their sexual orientations and their racial identities and their ethnic identities. That's how they will respond, because that's the kind of creatures that we now are. So, given that fact, it seems to me we can't but think about these questions when we're teaching or curating or constructing any of these practices in these institutions. It's inescapable. On the other hand, it's also true that it would be insane to respond only through an identity that you share with the curator or with the art object's creator or with some sort of theoretical entity that mobilizes the museum or the discipline. So, and one of the main reasons for that is very evident, I think, in the case of painting, say, but it's also true in the literary arts. It's that you can't make sense of most things through identity alone. The other set of slides I put up were about a response to a Guggenheim show about Spanish art, and I just want to notice how this will be just my second point. I want to notice how thinking about the art of Spanish produced some bizarre distortions. So we're actually just coming up to the right slides, but so this was Spanish art, they said, from El Greco to Picasso, right? Now, so you're thinking about Spain, but you pick a man with a Greek name, Domenikos Theotokopoulos, born in Crete, trained in Venice, to represent your anchoring point for Spanish art, and your ending point is Picasso, who's basically, for most of his life, a Parisian, or a Frenchman, if you like, I mean, in terms of his residence. So there he is. And he's a Spanish Frenchman whose work is profoundly shaped, this is a perfectly familiar narrative, but it's worth reminding ourselves of, but in his own view, by a response to a Villi sculpture that Matisse gave him, introduced to him by an American artist, American literary artist, Gertrude Stein. That kind of circulation, if you don't attend to that, you don't have to attend to it. You can just look at the painting. I'm in favor of mindless gazing at paintings. I don't mind that. But there's something you miss if you don't also attend to, as it were, where the object came from. And in general, where the object came from is not an identity. Even the art of the 80s, which was identitarian, didn't just come from an identity. And when it borrowed, it didn't just borrow within identities. It didn't just explain itself in relation to identities. So on the one hand, I think identity is inevitable, as I said. On the other hand, it's sort of crazy to think that that's all we need to think about. So I don't think there's anything wrong with shows organized in the most... I don't think there's anything wrong with shows that are organized around the idea of inclusion of formerly excluded things. That's fine. And if the basis of exclusion was identity, then it's fine to organize shows around the excluded, I think. But it isn't the only thing you can do, and it shouldn't be the only thing we do. And I think we've been through a period when we've done a fair amount of that. And so I'm interested in people thinking of other things to be doing, both in the university and in the museum.
I think all those distortions are amazing. In the Spanish show that you were commenting on, all those weird distortions, if we can get to the point where people are able to notice all those trajectories, that's a perfect exhibition for me. Spanish multifaceted view of Spain. Yes. That's, sorry, one addendum.
But I think, what the catalogue talked about was the kind of coherence and of this. What the catalogue talked about, instead of, as it were, celebrating and recognizing the internal inhomogeneity of Spain, was the phrase. This is the phrase from the catalogue: the overall coherence of the Spanish tradition.
Yeah,
now, I mean, that seems to me just. I'm not picking on these curators. I mean, that's an idea that a lot of people have, They think that if you talk about Spanish art, as it were, the only intelligible way to make sense of it is as a coherent something or other. But part of the point of the sort of theoretical understanding of identity that developed in the last couple of decades was that every form of identity is, as it were, also inhomogeneous, that identity is not the same as itself.
Now, being in my late 30s, I think that the whole discourse and the debates around identity politics was something that was still lingering on or continuing to have relevance in my early 20s when I started going to college. But now I see a new generation of artists emerging that have a very different relationship to that. Almost going back and rediscovering what that was all about. And I'm thinking about artists as like Juan Capistrán from Los Angeles, Hank Willis-Thomas, or Sharon Hayes that we also saw there. Sort of like moving on from a different focus that perhaps existed where a lot of artists in the 30s and 40s had conceptual art and sort of like radical manifestations of the 60s and 70s as a point of departure. Now, sort of like with an almost next generation of artists, so sort of revisiting identity politics. And I'm wondering where that longing comes from, and what the desire is behind this. For me, it was clear that when artists look back at the 60s and 70s, they were looking for perhaps the last really truly radical moment within art history where things could have been questioned on a really fundamental level. But now, with this particular question around identity politics, I'm not sure what the desires or needs or wants are that coming out of that.
I don't know.
Maybe you could talk about this a little bit on the background of the exhibition that you did at the ICA in Boston, which is an exhibition that took place in the present time, looking back. So even within yourself, there's this desire to introduce this perhaps to a younger audience as well. Or is this just a sort of summary of your own history and relationships?
No, I mean, I think in terms specifically of both the ACT UP exhibition and the 1980s exhibition, this will have been, I saw the sort of beginnings of the historicization of the 1980s around formations that I didn't recognize to be quote unquote true. Or rather, I should say that I saw that history was beginning to be told only through the lens of the market. And it was important to me to try and bring to the fore what I thought were the more important and generative moments of that period, which was in fact the sort of the task of the 80s to process the demands of 1970s feminism on the one hand, and also to, and how the processing of 70s feminism leads to profound fissures around any kind of cohesive idea of the category of woman. And so much so that feminism perhaps could no longer even organize itself around the category of woman as its central protagonist. And so, and that, you know, that shaking of the feminist sort of, you know, groundwork by theoreticians and artists, primarily queer and of color, was, that to me was the engine that drove the 80s, or that was the story I wanted to tell about the 1980s. And I remain sort of fearful that categories like post-feminist or post-black or even post-gender that we have now can only have that fantasied relationship to postness, in part because the market, for me as a curator, it's the market that does the wonderful job of tumbling all those stones in the great tumbler and polishing them till nothing has an edge and everything is quite smooth. And I wanted to reintroduce the raggedness of the debate and not smooth it over, and actually allow there were real fights then, and have those fights not be narrated as vitriolic or nasty, but in fact as profoundly generative, and really to try and reinvest, I think, to get at something that Kobena was saying, the way to allow ourselves to disagree and to not be so polite, that the politeness is also perhaps a function of the market pressures that we all exist within at this moment, whether we're in the academy, as we heard on the previous panel, or in the museum, or in publishing, or whatever it is, whatever cultural field we find ourselves in. I mean, that's not an answer, but.
Well, I chose the documentation from Sharon Hayes' project, In the Near Future, because I was fascinated in the way which her performances addressed both the archival relationship with practices of the late 60s, conceptual art and so on, but also the topos of the street, which I think is profoundly contested. I mean, there's a certain neoliberal understanding in which the only function of the street is to get access to shops. That's why you have streets. The idea that it might be a space of conviviality where people gather to express collectively held feelings simply provokes the most militarized responses, as we saw in Occupy and so on. So the street is very interesting, and I think also in the African-American context, the street is a cliche. The street is supposed to be where a certain kind of populist blackness manifests itself, and if you're not there, if that's not where you're located, your identity is in question. So it's interesting to look at the way in which artists have addressed this. I think the idea of this fascination with the last moment of radical democratic outbursts of the 1960s is part of it. But I also think it's interesting in terms of reactivating dormant potentials. I think there's an almost Benjaminian philosophy of history that many contemporary artists have. So it's not quite that was then, this is now, this is the new generation, they're doing something new. I think what's interesting is the sense in which they are acting on something that was latent, but which in the conjunctural conditions of that moment perhaps couldn't have been realized, couldn't have been activated. So in that sense, I see the issue not so much in terms of medium, this is a performance, that's a painting, and so on, but thematically, because what fascinates me in the Black Atlantic context is the archive and the way in which what's continually new for so many contemporary artists from the 80s onwards, think of Renee Green, Fred Wilson, Isaac Julian, Black Audio Film Collective, but also the Otolith group today, for example, is this interest in the archive, in going back to have a second look at the materials from which historical narratives are constructed. And just the last part of this is to say that the image of the Black and Western art, a huge project that was started by Dominique de Menil as part of her response to civil rights in 1960. The first book was published in 1978. It was then resuscitated by Henry Louis Gates at Harvard and David Beinman. And I had the responsibility of doing the closing chapter, which is everything since 1980, in a series that started with the Egyptians and the Greeks, so no pressure then. But the Isaac Julian, when there was a talk at the British Museum about 18 months ago, was saying how important it was when, because he and I were both at St. Martin's at the same time in the late 70s, early 80s, how important this publication was as an archive. There isn't a one-to-one relationship. Aha, I saw this work and now it's in my film. But I think for many Black Atlantic practitioners, this interest in revisiting the past, whether it's the recent past of the 60s or the deep historical past of the 1890s, Haiti and so on, is what defines their take on contemporaneity.
So, apart perhaps from the exhibitions that I mentioned at the beginning, or this longing of younger artists wanting to sort of revisit certain strategies of the 60s and 70s, you mentioned a lot, the term post-black came up, post-feminism, and perhaps your discomfort with that. And for me, it never really signaled the end of a particular period or way of thinking, but it was almost always like something that was out of reach, but where one had to go, sort of like a destination somewhere, very, very far away that we wanted to reach, or we want to reach at a certain point.
Yeah, I'm really, partly because I was once tempted by that thought, I'm particularly worried about it and particularly concerned to resist it. I think, so the idea that it's back to the point the first point I made, the object of the exercise is not to get beyond identity. So whether it's post-feminist or post-gender or post-black or post-Dominican or post-Spanish, that can't be the object of the exercise. Of course, some of these may fall away. Not every identity that has ever existed and been salient is still around, of course. But the idea that, as it were, the object of the exercise is to get beyond identities, that's sort of it's a sort of strange idea. It depends upon thinking that, identity's created all these problems, so if we get rid of it, things will get better. But that's not right. But
is that really the thought? Or are there certain concerns within the construct of identity that are the ones that we want to maybe move on from?
Exactly.
Others we want to keep and continue with?
Right. So what's needed is reform or revolution, rethinking, remaking. That's all right, but that doesn't take you to a post point. That's just history. That's just how things go, as it were. And we want to push them in good directions rather than bad directions. But I think if you have in your mind the thought that it's identity itself that's the problem, rather than the sexist construction of gender or the racist construction of racial identity and so on, then you'll be pushing in the wrong directions, I think. Yeah. And I say this as someone guilty of this thought in the past, which is why I'm particularly vigilant about it. I think, so I don't know what will happen to African American identity, of course. I don't know what it will be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. But I'm confident that if it goes away, it won't be because we've gone beyond identity. It'll be because we've gone somewhere else in the realm of identity. And I suspect there will be traces of an old African American identity in almost anything that is produced in the next 1,000 years, that we make a ridiculous prophecy. In our culture. So I think the sort of post-talk is just not helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something that I don't even know if I agree with, just for the sake of putting it out there. There was a moment when post-feminist as a term was of real interest to me, because I thought the people who used it the most were young, and on the one hand, that made me very nervous, but on the other hand, I felt like, well, I can't be one of those people who tells someone in their 20s that the term they're using is incorrect. Like, I don't want to be that person. And so maybe what they mean when they say post-feminist, although of course now I'm proving that I am precisely that person by imputing something to them, but maybe what's at stake in a term like post-feminist is to see feminist as precisely a kind of historically bound struggle associated with certain formations and certain times and places that isn't holding now, and the need for a new term is a way to try and marshal energy around precisely the problem, but to reorganize ourselves in a way that perhaps a certain former set of demands or identities or styles, right, or ways of thinking were organized in the 1970s. But I think we do see, even among people who use terms like post-black or post-feminism, actually an incredible sense of attention to the very issues that might attend the problems of thinking through those identities. But I'm just to get back a little bit to the problem of, the homosexual or same, versus queer, post-gender, post-sexuality, same-sex. Like, the ease with which I was, and in some ways am still prepared to abandon the homosexual identity and that whole framework of ideas and practices and gestures and intonations. I'm personally struggling with. Like, I wonder how do we both carry with us these formations that seem antiquated and mildly embarrassing as we, generate the new identity that we're so enthralled to be part of?
The one thing for me when I think of you saying, let's move beyond identity because we want to go to these broader fields like feminism, gender, have all those categories be then divided into micro categories so that they can fit into something else. And we refuse to be something like, we want to be post-Black because Black was too marginalizing, too concrete and specific, and we want to have all the nuances. Where do we go to from here if it's not going to be an identity and it's not going to be this post that allows you to redefine and bring a bigger nuance or more defined nuance? Where do we go from there? What would you guys who, sure.
You go back to the future. You go back to 1492. I'll speak up for the postmodern, not because I'm identified with it, but because it did important work in the 80s and afterwards by bringing to light what was the foundations of these institutions. Because a lot of decision makers lack self-awareness. They don't know what's buried in the closet. They don't know what's down there in the archives. But that was brought out for discussion by the Post, and I think the Post has been very productive. Postmodern fell away during the 90s because, and Anthony wrote about this, is the Post in post-colonial, the same as postmodern, which is why I teach this to our undergraduates all the time. It was a ground-clearing operation. It revealed so much that was unsaid, that was axiomatic, taken for granted. The idea that some people don't have identities because they speak for man. Yeah. This is what humanism was all about. And there were lots of good things in it. The idea of freedom, equality, solidarity, social justice, but a lot of rubbish as well. So it was about clearing out sorting out what's worth keeping and what can be questioned. So postmodernism fell away during the 1990s because it paved the way for globalization theory. But globalization in turn was the debate was presentist. It's all about now. It's all about the new thing. It was completely dehistoricized. It's only in the 2000s that you have art historians beginning to say, well, this isn't new. It didn't start in the 1980s. There have been hybridity, syncretism, transculturation, all those forms. These are just words, and the differences between them are really important for understanding interrelationship, interdependent, transformative relationships have always been there. They either weren't recognized, they were invisible, they were blindsided. Or there were other stories that were preferred narratives. So I think that idea of going back to 1492, which is where the archive leads you, gives rise to the suggestion that there have been many kinds of globalization. What we're dealing with now is the most recent one that's being driven, that's being led and directed by neoliberalism. And that brings in the question of how individual artistic practices and the objects they create relate to contexts and conjunctures. And I think that is still unfinished. I don't think that there's a ready-made model or framework in terms of understanding what Anthony was saying, that it's not a question of getting beyond. There's nothing beyond. What we want to understand are the relations between. What's the relationship between the world and the work? And I think then nothing much has changed. In terms of some of the big stalemate is you either go the formalist route and you look very closely at objects and you look for meaning inside the object, or you go the contextualist route and you risk losing sight of the aesthetic, the ability of an object to move you, even though the person is long gone, and so on. And I think that either or approach is part of the common sense of a lot of departments, a lot of museums, a lot of galleries, in terms of how we talk about what art does when it goes out into the world.
But Kobena, how do we square, you're in Anthony's very beautiful sense of like the longue durée, which reminds me of, it's this apocryphal story, but apparently Deng Xiaoping was asked at one point what he thought about the French Revolution, and he apparently said, that he didn't know because it it wasn't over yet, which is sort of amazing. Too early to say. You know, like couldn't tell you, which is an amazing long view of history, but with the other sense of urgency around social justice rights, right? Like, I mean, I sense that, you know, one's dismay with Obama around certain ideas around social justice. Like, no, I don't feel like waiting. Thank you very much. I feel like you pushing through and staying true to what I know you must in fact believe, right? So, like, how do you guys suggest we navigate these two very different versions of time? Because marginalized people have been asked to wait often.
Well, you have to work at both levels, because so I just wrote a book about a number of sort of important moral revolutions. For example, the end of foot binding in China. People did things at every moment of that process. They were doing things, and some urgent things. They had organized meetings, societies, and so on. But it took a generation. And we're not going to be able to undo, for example, the massive inequalities we've created in the world, the increased inequality we've created in the world over the last couple of decades. We're not going to be able to undo that. There's nothing we can do to undo that clutch. We have to move along. And so, on the other hand, there are things you can do in the meanwhile, but they don't solve the big problem. So I think you just have to, you do need the sense that, I mean, one of the things that's, for me, about the sort of thinking about things like the French Revolution is, look, okay, maybe Deng Xiaoping doesn't know, you know, what the ultimate meaning of the French Revolution is. Maybe he's right, but still, something about it made the world better. Right? We got rid of the idea that, we disestablished the idea, we established the Jacobin idea that an hereditary aristocracy was just not entitled to boss everybody around. Everybody in the world after that, they betray the idea in practice, but in theory that we all speak of the people. We all have a sense that, for example, everybody, every citizen is equal. This is not a trivial change. Now, as I say, we betray that thought all the time as well. And so there's much work to do, and some of it can be done in the relatively short term, but a lot of it, as I say, in terms of economic stuff, just can't be done in the short run, as far as I can see. There's nothing we can do that's both politically feasible and likely to work. So I think it's very hard to say to someone, as I sometimes do when I'm talking to my students, look, so far as I can see, when you start one of these big movements, you have to understand that you're going to be handing on a better world to your children. You can't think that it's going to happen tomorrow. All the work that went into gay rights in the late 60s and early 70s, that's paying off. But it didn't pay off immediately, and things were very bad, right? Things got worse, actually, for gay people for a period because of their resistance. So, I mean, this is depressing, I suppose. It would be nice to feel that one could deal with problems that are urgent urgently, but I think, you know, they're so massive that we have to, and one thing that art, I think, can do, and this is a very old-fashioned and perhaps even reactionary thought, one thing art can do is keep our spirits up, right, as we continue the struggle. Not lose sight of the fact that while we're losing, there is the possibility of a long-term victory.
Yeah. I would respond in two ways. One is to think about the difference between self-interest and disinterestedness. I think the bourgeois public sphere in the Enlightenment, with the idea of disinterestedness, created a circumscribed space of freedom. So in the classroom, you have academic freedom. In the gallery and in the museum, you have freedom of expression. Of course, it's not unconditioned, which is what the idealists didn't recognize. There are worldly circumstances that determine who gets in, what objects get kept, how it's all valued and judged, and so on. But is there an argument to say the idea of disinterestedness might be something to retain and rework vis-a-vis the kind of dumbing down of corporate populism, this, blockbuster model that so many institutions, including universities, are all being driven by, where it's all about the numbers. Because I think out there in the real world, which is what people who are inside the institutions say, where you're acting on self-interest, where justice does matter, and where the betrayal of social justice really does matter because their body's on the line, you do have to make a decision. You do have to cut. So there does have to be an either-or. And I think it's misguided to think that there's something intrinsically wrong about dichotomous reasoning. You do have to get there. And that's what drawing the line, making a political decision that's the basis of action is all about. But the gallery, as a space of freedom, is about exploring the conditions under which alternatives might become thinkable, conditions under which a different kind of future might become imaginable for the first time. So I think that's important. And the other point is simply to say that 1993 is, I think, very apropos, because it was with Clinton, who is often referred to as the first African-American president, but also with Tony Blair, that we realized it is getting a lot worse. Because neoliberalism was driven by neoconservatives in the first 10 years, but it was when the politicians of the boomer generation brought in the cultural literacy of the 1960s that it's clear there is no point of exit. There is no outside anymore. And I think that's, Obama has inherited that. And the issue is to perhaps think about, is it time to let go of that identification that always positioned the African American, the black diaspora subject as the West's best critic, challenging the West to live up to its ideals. Perhaps there's a kind of mourning that we have to think about in terms of that identification has perhaps become outrun.
I hate to interrupt you, but in order to get everybody to lunch on time, I think we have to wrap up our conversation here and see if there's any questions in the audience. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for all your really thoughtful contributions. I just thought it was really kind of awesome and miraculous that you got through a discussion about the past 20 years and changes that have happened, and you didn't say anything about the internet. And
what's the internet, honey?
One thing I think that's important about the internet and what it does to identity is because a lot of the identity politics that were going on 20 years ago that you were talking about are really bodied, or about your gender and your race and your, nationality or whatever. And the internet has kind of allowed people to disembody their identity. And I know that message boards and chat rooms and stuff, your words and your ideas are really how people know you now. And how does that play into identity politics, and are those identities worth considering as entities, like disembodied identities, identities of interest or ideas? Thank you.
I'll answer it briefly through a series that I did. I feel like the internet will give you this false sense of empowerment. Suddenly you're giving yourself a haircut because someone in a tutorial is doing all these things. So you'll feel empowered and assume this new identity, but ultimately it many times reinforces whatever pressures you're facing outside. So I was actually borrowing from these images of people who post, sometimes their whole families will encourage these wildings, these fights that happen, and it's like a modern version of the hysteric female moment. And it's now spread through like reality television and everything like that. So in a sense, I feel like the internet will give you the space to troll and to assume different identities, but ultimately they're just pushed and propelled by whatever you are facing on the real world.
Just very briefly, I'd agree with that, because I think performativity is the cultural dominant of contemporary capitalism in many ways. And I think the idea that it is intrinsically emancipatory might need to be called into question. You're describing a phenomenon that's very similar to reality television, which is that the awareness that identities can be performed and they're interchangeable, they're not fixed, they're not essences, is taking place under conditions in which the stakes have gone down. It doesn't really make any difference. So 40 years ago, for a guy to wear makeup on the streets would be taking a risk because the stakes were really high, because people thought that gender was real. But it's very different when everyone accepts a certain kind of laissez-faire performativity. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't really matter. So it sounds a bit doom and gloom. I know there are people that argue about the digital commons, and there is that aspect that we shouldn't lose sight of, because it can go either way. There's nothing that technology has no necessary belonging. It has to be socially embedded in terms of how its potentials are exploited, how its potentials can be activated for alternative means. But I'm kind of with Helen, because my concern is that when these devices have been used to degrade the public sphere, when people walk around with their devices in front of them, I've had to say this twice over the last 18 months, you need to look where you're going. Because it is that neoliberal common sense that my world is more important than the people around me. So it's also passive-aggressive. It means that somebody else has to get out of the way in order for the traffic in the city to flow freely. So I think it's quite insidious and interesting. There's nothing prescriptive, but I think it's interesting the way in which these technological advances have naturalized this privatization of experience, including the privatization of identity.
There's another question.
Yes, thank you. This has been fascinating, and part of what's fascinating about it is how it remains so complicated and murky. Because I'm saying to myself as I listen to you all, well, I haven't heard the word essentialism, which is interesting. And then I think, what are we holding on to when we hold on to the concept of identity? Anthony, when you talked about the Spanish exhibition and how all of these different tendrils of difference were inside every object, so then I'm thinking, what identity do I bring to that, or the makers of that? And aren't we more talking right now, or couldn't I raise the idea of what it means to have an identification with something? Not that it is your identity in any sense that you were born with this or born into it, because certainly I've never liked the idea of false consciousness at all. It's always been something that has bothered me, because I think human beings are so complicated, so complex. And why we would identify with something or not is of real importance. But what would happen? You know, Einstein said about time that we have time only so that everything doesn't happen all at the same time. That's why we have time. And if you apply that to other categories, what would happen if we didn't have, and I don't mean this in an idealist sense, I'm speaking philosophically, what would happen if we didn't hold on to identity?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, right? Because it implies, I mean, in a way, for me, it gets at some of the ideas around absence rather than abundance, because the identities that we are offered now and our relationship to them via largely performativity and perhaps the internet for, you know, your generation, are so phenomenally fantastic, right? That I can be anything, I can perform all these roles. But I think I can only think of it actually in somewhat old-fashioned formalist terms, which is, like, you need a figure-ground relation, you know, in order for there to be a picture, you know, in order for there to be meaning, and everything that comes with meaning, pleasure, discordance, confusion, you know, all of it. There's got to be. It seems to me that's how we've organized ourselves, and without. I mean, I know the moments where I feel like I don't have an identity, and I think we probably all have them, right? Where we feel kind of free, right? I'm aware that in those moments, I actually am something the most like an American subject I ever am. Because I tend to be in a rental car No, so, I mean, I don't actually mean that it's humorous. I mean that it's like these moments in which I imagine myself to be not bound to the things I am for others is a moment in which I often am enacting the most cliched version of my Americanness.
I think we have to wrap it up. I've been signaled no more questions, so I wanted to thank the panel very much for all the very thought-provoking comments.